Hello and welcome to this episode of Bake It Up a Notch. I'm Erin Jeanne McDowell and this is episode 2 of the 3-part Custard Spectacular. I decided to devote a special episode to each of the 3 major types of custard. And next up is stovetop custards. Today I almost feel like I'm back in pastry school because I am in the Food 52 test kitchens. And in pastry school, we sometimes called these boiled custards or stirred custards. I think it's a little bit easier to just refer to them as stovetop custards because that is where you cook them. And today we are focusing on my all-time favorite stovetop custard, the one that truly has my heart, pudding. Okay, yes, there are other types of stovetop custards that are not pudding, and in fact, we've made several of them here on Bake It Up a Notch before. Things like creme anglaise, fruit curd, and pastry cream. In this episode, we are going to focus on pudding because, well, yes, I love them. I find them deeply nostalgic, and I also think it is such an easy, fun dessert to make. There's another reason that I really love puddings. They are really the basis of one of my favorite types of pies, cream pies. Cream pies are usually a pudding or some other type of stovetop custard in a crust topped with whipped cream. So if you learn to master stovetop custards, not only are you going to have a delicious ability to eat pudding, but you're also halfway to a really delicious pie. While making your own homemade pudding at home isn't quite as easy as grabbing a box of the instant stuff off the shelf of the grocery store, it's not far off. Homemade pudding is so much easier than most people realize, and I really hope this episode is going to encourage you to make puddings because I love them. I want everyone to make as many puddings as possible. I want you to create your own flavors. I want you to make delicious cream pies. I want this to be such a fun, such a delicious episode, and in fact, we're going to make 2 very yummy, different kinds of pudding. I can't wait to dive in. Let's get baking. Okay, let's start our butterscotch pudding. I love this recipe. It's probably one of my most made puddings of all time. And it's gonna be a great opportunity to review concepts we've covered here on Bake It Up a Notch before, because pudding is really approachable, but there's a lot of great lessons hidden inside it. So we're gonna start by heating up our dairy base. We have both milk and cream. This is our milk. I'm also gonna add the cream. And I'm gonna go ahead and scrape the seeds of this vanilla bean and drop those inside. You can actually drop the whole vanilla bean inside as well, and as it's heating up, it's going to pull even more seeds out, which is wonderful. We can also add our little bit of salt in there as well. And actually, it's not such a little bit of salt because this is my salty butterscotch pudding recipe, and we're even gonna put more salt on it later, a little bit of flaky salt on top. So good. Okay, let's start heating that up. While that's heating up, let's get kind of our sugar mixture ready. This is the way that I like to work with puddings when they are thickened with both eggs and a starch. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about this later, but it's really important that the starch is distributed uniformly. The flavor of butterscotch usually contains dark brown sugar and butter. So of course we've got both of those in this recipe, and we're gonna use the dark brown sugar to help us break up any clumps of the cornstarch. Also, when you mix the cornstarch and any kind of granulated sugar together, what it does is when that sugar hits the warm base, the dairy base, it disperses really uniformly. And that helps us have an easier time of not having any clumps form in our pudding. So what I'm gonna do, I've got the sugar here. I'm gonna use my hands to kind of mix them together. So let's go ahead and add the cornstarch in. And then I'm just gonna use my hands like this to make sure that they're evenly combined. So my milk is starting to simmer, and that's a good sign, but I don't want to add it just yet. I want to wait till the very last minute and add my egg yolks to this sugar mixture. And this is something else we've talked about on Bake It Up a Notch before. Sugar is hygroscopic. So if we add any kind of egg to sugar too soon in the process and it sits for a long time, the sugar has the ability to suck some of the natural moisture out of the egg. And this is what can make it kind of clumpy or gritty or grainy. There's sort of like a rumor that sugar can cook eggs or egg yolks, and that isn't exactly true. It's the same when you make salt cured yolks or something like that. It's pulling out the moisture, and that's what ends up giving it that firmer texture. So I whisk that in a little bit. Let's add a little bit of our warm milk to temper the mixture, and we're just gonna whisk really well to combine. Once it's really nice and combined, we'll put it back into our pot and we will start whisking it. Now, I like to do this whole mixing process largely with a whisk because it helps make sure you don't have any clumps and you're gonna end up with the silkiest, smoothest pudding. But it is nice to have a silicone spatula nearby to help get into those edges and corners of the pot as you cook. So let's go ahead and return this. We tempered it by adding some of the warm liquid to it, gradually raising the egg's temperature. And now we can safely put the mixture back in the pot because we sort of gradually raised its temperature. Whereas if we just put the eggs into this warm pot, we'd have a bigger risk of scrambling them, curdling the mixture, all of that. So now we're gonna cook this over sort of a medium heat, whisking constantly until it starts to thicken. At first, you're gonna see it visibly thicken. We might even see kind of streaks from our whisk being left behind. But this pudding isn't done until the pudding reaches first boil. We're gonna talk more about this later, but remember, first boil isn't small bubbles around the outside edge of the pot, it's big fat bubbles more towards the center of the pot. That's how we know that the starch has been activated and that the egg yolks have been heated to the appropriate temperature. Okay, it's reached first boil. All I need to do is add one of the most important butterscotch ingredients, butter. Whisk that in. The final step to making sure you have the silkiest, smoothest pudding is to strain it. So I'm gonna go ahead and strain it into a heat-safe bowl. Now you can let it cool completely in this bowl and then portion it. You can then put it into a serving bowl. I actually do love warm pudding, and the #1 chef snack for me is what's gonna be left in this. Like, this is my jam. I'm gonna strain this into a heat-safe bowl, and I can cover it directly with plastic wrap if I want to avoid forming a skin on the surface. But that's sort of up to you. If you don't mind a little bit of a thicker skin at the top, you're just gonna wanna cover the top of the bowl rather than the surface of the pudding itself. And then you're gonna let it chill down until it is completely cool for a couple of hours. Once it's cool, you can portion it into serving dishes. You can put it into one big serving bowl. Really, however you wanna do it. I used to sometimes make myself little homemade pudding cups and just leave them in the refrigerator, take them to work. It's really kind of fun, and pudding is really so simple to make. Remember, the pudding is going to continue to thicken as it cools. So it may seem a little bit soft right now, but it is going to have a thicker, creamier texture after a little bit of chill time. One of the things I love the most about stovetop custards is that they behave a little bit more like cooking than like baking in a lot of ways, meaning you can really riff on them easily, you can adjust the consistency and texture on the fly if needed, and that actually makes them one of the most suitable desserts I know for adjusting for different dietary restrictions. And I had a dream for this episode of making a really delicious coconut pudding, sort of like where it had flecks of coconut in it, the way tapioca pudding has little bits of tapioca pearl in it. And so I just thought, if I'm already making it coconut, it could so easily be dairy-free, so let's do it. The coolest part is, this is the same exact process as we just did for the salty butterscotch pudding. So I think it's a good opportunity to go into a little bit more of the science behind some of these things that are going on to help make sure we've really got this process down. To start, let's heat up all of our dairy, or non-dairy, in this case, bases. We've got both coconut milk and coconut cream. Now, this is not cream of coconut, which is a sweetened canned product. We're using coconut cream, which is available in the health food section of most grocery stores or at natural food stores. There goes the coconut cream. Look how thick that is. Delicious. And we're also going to use a small amount of the dairy-free milk of your choice. I really love oat milk as a dairy-free milk, and especially in desserts and baking, because it has a really creamy flavor and consistency. It's just really great to work with. I'm going to turn that on and let that come to a simmer, and then we'll get some of our other ingredients ready. When we made the salty butterscotch pudding, I talked about dissolving or distributing the cornstarch in with the granulated sugar so that it disperses really evenly. But I want to go a little bit more into the role that the starch and the eggs have in this recipe. Both the starch and the egg yolks are contributing to a thickening inside the final pudding. But there's also something interesting at play here. And we've talked about it on Bake It Up a Notch before, but I think it's fascinating. There's a naturally occurring enzyme in eggs that loves to digest starch. This means if you don't heat the pudding to the correct temperature to kill that enzyme, you could end up with a pudding at the end of the cooking process that seems really glorious and thick, put it in the refrigerator and come back later and find it kind of soupy and thin. So it's really, really important. That's why we've got to reach that first boil. That's how we know that the eggs have been sufficiently cooked and also that the starch has been activated, and it will stay activated because we offed that nasty enzyme. Listen, it's an enzyme. It's a living thing. Kill is what it is. We've got to end its life. So it's really important that we heat that pudding to first boil so that we no longer have to worry about that enzyme and that we know that the starch is activated. That's how we're going to end up with the thickest, creamiest final pudding. No killing involved. So let's stir our cornstarch into the granulated sugar. This time I don't need to use my hands because I can just use a whisk because granulated sugar is much finer and drier. So again, the granules are helping to break up any existing clumps in the cornstarch, and they'll also help to disperse it evenly in the hot liquid, because what does the granulated sugar want to do in the hot liquid? Start to dissolve. I'll whisk in the egg yolks, then add a small amount of the warm liquid to temper them. Our tempered egg mixture will go back into the pot. Now we'll cook this until it thickens up, 3 to 5 minutes. Okay, the pudding has come to first boil. Let's go ahead and strain it. And straining isn't a totally necessary step, especially if you do a great job of cooking your pudding. But as you'll see, there were some little clumps at the very end of this, so I'm happy to remove those. And also, there are some little bits in eggs, no matter how carefully you separate them, that can make not a totally smooth texture. So just straining that little bit out is like that little bit of extra effort that I always feel is well worth it. Once I've passed this through the strainer, I'm going to stir in the vanilla. Again, we like to add vanilla extract at the end when we're doing some kind of cooking process because it's going to retain the strongest flavor. So I'll stir in the vanilla. And I'm also going to stir in a small amount of sweetened coconut. If you wanted, you could toast this coconut first. Just make sure it's cooled before you add it to your pudding. All right, now we can cover the pudding directly with plastic wrap or cover the surface of the bowl with plastic wrap and let it refrigerate until the pudding is nice and chilled. And again, it's going to thicken more as it cools. So we've already talked about a lot of the possible mistakes that can happen with pudding. That's one of the reasons I love it. It really is so simple. But let's just review them because no one should want homemade pudding and end up with any kind of pudding mistake. Plus, one of the most common pudding mistakes is actually somewhat easy to take care of. One of the first things I want to remind you is to be very careful when tempering your eggs. This is one of those steps that only takes a little bit of extra time, but is so worth it. If you don't temper the eggs, you could end up with a lumpy custard, and it can also get lumpy from cornstarch left behind. So just remember, either way, you don't want little bits of coagulated egg, scrambled eggs inside your pudding, so be careful to temper. The other one I've been talking about a lot is being very careful to bring that custard to first boil. Now remember, this is only important if the recipe uses both eggs and starch as a thickener. In front of me, I have a custard that is both lumpy because I didn't temper it well, and it's also runny because I didn't bring it to first boil. It was quite thick when I put it in the refrigerator yesterday, but today it is so liquidy that it falls off the spoon. And we also see these big lumps in it. Most of those lumps are scrambled eggs because I added the eggs directly into the warm liquid. This is what you want to avoid. And I want to remind you that just straining this mixture now will not be enough. That will remove the eggs, but it won't remove the cooked egg flavor. However, if you manage to keep a smooth custard, but it just ends up too thin, maybe because you didn't bring it to first boil, there is a way to save it. Just fold in some stiffly whipped cream. That cream is going to help to thicken any thin texture, and you're still going to end up with a creamy, delicious dessert. Salty, butterscotchy, creamy. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Bake It Up a Notch, where we talked all things stovetop custards. As always, both of these delicious recipes are available in the video description below, so head down there to snag them or head to food52.com. And if this episode inspires you to make your own stovetop custards, please use hashtag #BakeItUpANotch and leave us a comment here on YouTube. I love to know what you're making in your own kitchens. So until next time, I'd like to wish you happy baking.